The gunshot echoed through the canyon like thunder, sending a flock of startled ravens into the crimson sunset sky as Delilah Nolan clutched her 3-month-old son tighter to her chest. Her heart pounded against her ribs as she pressed her back against the rough stone wall of the narrow cave, praying the baby wouldn't cry out and reveal their hiding place. Utah Territory, 1876. Delilah had been on the run for 3 days now, her provisions dwindling to nothing more than a few strips of dried beef and less than half a canteen of water. The outlaws who had murdered her husband wouldn't stop until they found her and the baby the only witnesses to their brutal crime. The gold dust her husband had discovered in their small creek before his death was what they wanted, but Delilah knew they wouldn't leave witnesses. She held her breath as she heard hoofbeats approaching, the rhythmic pounding growing louder. Just one rider from the sound of it, but that didn't mean the others weren't close behind. The baby little Thomas stirred against her chest, his tiny fingers curling against the rough fabric of her dirt-stained dress. "Please, sweet boy," she whispered, her voice barely audible even to herself. Just a little longer. But exhaustion and hunger had taken their toll on both of them. Thomas let out a small whimper that quickly built into a hungry cry, the sound amplified by the stone walls surrounding them. The hoofbeats stopped abruptly. Delilah froze, her blood turning to ice in her veins. She had no weapon, nothing to defend herself or her child with. All she could do was press deeper into the shadows of the cave and pray. Heavy footsteps crunched on gravel outside. A tall shadow fell across the cave entrance. "Hello." A deep voice called, "Anybody in there?" Delilah remained silent, her hand gently covering Thomas's mouth to quiet his cries. "I ain't gonna hurt you," the voice continued. "Heard a baby crying, sounds like you might need help." Still, Delilah didn't move. Trust had cost her husband his life. The man sighed. "Look, madam, if you're in there, I understand your caution. Times are hard out here, but night's coming and these hills ain't safe after dark. Mountain lions, not to mention the Blackwater gang's been spotted in these parts." At the mention of the Blackwater gang, the very men hunting her Delilah inadvertently gasped. "Ah," the man said, "so you are in there." His tone softened. "I'm going to step back from the entrance, leave my gun belt on the ground out here, then I'll just sit and wait. You decide if you want my help." True to his word, Delilah heard the sound of a gun belt being set down, then boots retreating several paces. For several long minutes, Delilah remained frozen in indecision. Thomas's cries had grown more insistent, his tiny body squirming against her. She knew she couldn't stay in the cave indefinitely. Without food, water, or proper shelter, they wouldn't survive another day. Taking a deep breath, she inched toward the cave entrance, keeping Thomas close to her chest. The dying sunlight momentarily blinded her as she peered out. A man sat on a rock about 20 feet away, his hands resting easily on his knees. He looked to be in his early 30s, with a strong jawline partially covered by a short beard. His clothes were dusty from the trail, but well kept, not the typical garb of an outlaw. His gun belt lay on the ground where he'd promised, well out of reach. "Evening, madam," he said, making no move to stand. His voice was gentle, like someone talking to a spooked horse. "Name's Lucas Wright. Most folks call me Luke." Delilah stepped partially out of the cave, still ready to retreat. "How do I know you're not with them?" she demanded, her voice hoarse from thirst. "With who?" Luke asked, his brow furrowing. "The Blackwater gang," she said, watching his reaction carefully, his expression darkened. "Madam, I've been tracking those vermin for the better part of 6 months. They killed my brother outside of Durango." He slowly rolled up his sleeve, revealing a badge pinned to the inside of his shirt. U.S. Marshal. Relief flooded through Delilah, making her knees weak. Thomas wailed louder, his tiny face red with effort. "Looks like the little one's hungry," Luke observed, slowly standing. "I've got some supplies on my horse, nothing fancy but better than starving." Delilah hesitated only a moment before nodding. As Luke walked to his horse, she stepped fully out of the cave, getting her first proper look at him. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his movements confident but careful. His horse, a sturdy Appaloosa, stood patiently nearby, laden with saddlebags and bedroll. Luke returned with a canteen and some wrapped parcels. "Water," he said, offering the canteen first. And some jerky and hardtack. Got a little dried fruit, too. Delilah accepted the water gratefully, taking a long drink before wetting her finger and letting Thomas suck on it for moisture. The baby calmed somewhat, though his hunger remained evident. "How old is he?" Luke asked, keeping a respectful distance. 3 months, she answered, accepting some of the dried fruit. "His name is Thomas," Luke nodded. "And you, madam?" She hesitated before answering. Delilah Nolan." "Well, Mrs. Nolan, it's getting dark. I can make camp here, keep watch while you rest. In the morning, we can figure out where to go." "They killed my husband," Delilah said suddenly, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. 4 days ago, at our homestead near Echo Canyon. They were looking for the gold dust Robert had found." Her voice broke. "They'll kill us too if they find us." Luke's expression hardened. "They won't find you," he said with quiet determination. "I'll protect you both, always." Something in his voice, the conviction, the certainty, made Delilah believe him. For the first time in days, she allowed herself to hope. As the stars appeared overhead, Luke built a small fire in a depression where the light wouldn't be visible from a distance. He offered Delilah his bedroll while he prepared to sleep sitting up, his back against a rock and his rifle across his lap. "Why are you helping us?" Delilah asked, as she settled Thomas into a makeshift bed crafted from Luke's spare shirt. Luke was quiet for a moment, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "Because it's the right thing to do," he finally said, "and because I know what it's like to lose someone to those animals." He looked at her directly. "Get some rest, Mrs. Nolan. Tomorrow we ride for Monticello. It's small, but there's law there, and you'll both be safer." Delilah nodded, too exhausted to argue. As she drifted off to sleep, the last thing she saw was Luke's vigilant silhouette against the star-filled sky, a steadfast guardian in a world that had shown her little mercy. Morning came with the soft warbling of desert birds and the gentle rustling of Luke tending the fire. Delilah awoke with a start, momentarily forgetting where she was until her eyes fell on Thomas, still sleeping peacefully beside her. Then she saw Luke, his back to her as he brewed coffee in a small tin pot. "Morning," he said without turning around, somehow sensing she was awake. "Coffee's almost ready. It ain't much, but it'll warm you up." Delilah sat up, smoothing her tangled hair with her fingers. "Thank you," she said, her voice still rough with sleep. Luke poured the dark liquid into a tin cup and offered it to her. As she took it, their fingers brushed momentarily, and Delilah felt an unexpected warmth that had nothing to do with the coffee. "Did you sleep at all?" she asked, noticing the shadows under his eyes. "Enough," he answered with a small smile. "Been sleeping with one eye open for years now. Comes with the badge." Thomas stirred beside her, his little face scrunching up as he prepared to cry. Delilah quickly set the coffee aside and picked him up, cradling him against her chest. "He's hungry," she said, a note of worry in her voice. "I've been trying to feed him, but with the stress and not eating properly myself." She trailed off, embarrassed, understanding dawned in Luke's eyes. "There's a ranch about 2 hours' ride from here," he said. "Family name of Johnson. They've got a new baby themselves, might be able to help." Hope flared in Delilah's chest. "You think they would? Folks help each other out here," Luke said simply. "It's how we survive." He stood, dusting off his pants. "We should get moving, though. I don't like staying in one place too long with the Blackwater gang in the area." Within half an hour, they had packed up camp and were mounted on Luke's horse, Delilah seated behind him with Thomas securely tied to her chest in a makeshift sling created from Luke's bandana. "Hold on tight," Luke instructed as they set off at a steady pace through the rugged terrain. Delilah tentatively placed her hands on Luke's sides, but as the horse navigated a particularly steep descent, she instinctively wrapped her arms around his waist, pressing closer against his back. She felt his muscles tense momentarily, then relax. "You're safe," he said over his shoulder, misinterpreting her gesture as fear. "I won't let you fall." For 2 hours they rode in companionable silence, stopping only once to water the horse at a small stream. The landscape gradually changed from rocky outcroppings to more open country, with scattered juniper and piñon pines. Finally, they crested a hill and saw a small ranch nestled in the valley below a modest house with a barn and corral, several horses grazing in a pasture. "That's the Johnson place," Luke said. Nice folks. Daniel Johnson served with me in the war before settling out here with his wife Martha. As they approached, a man emerged from the barn, a rifle ready in his hands until he recognized Luke. Luke Wright, as I live and breathe. The man called out, lowering his weapon and striding forward with a broad smile. He was a stocky man with a sun-weathered face and friendly eyes. What brings you to these parts? Luke dismounted and helped Delilah down with gentle hands. Daniel, this is Mrs. Delilah Nolan and her son Thomas. They're in some trouble, need a safe place to rest. Daniel's expression grew serious as he took in Delilah's disheveled appearance and the hungry baby. Blackwater gang, he asked Luke in a low voice. Luke nodded grimly. Then you've come to the right place, Daniel said firmly. He turned to the house and called out, Martha, we've got company. A woman appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. When she saw Delilah and the baby, understanding immediately crossed her face. Bring them in, Daniel, she called, disappearing back inside. Daniel led them into the simple but clean home, where Martha was already preparing food. A cradle sat near the fire, a sleeping infant inside. This is Sarah, Martha said, noticing Delilah's glance toward the cradle. 4 months old and healthy as can be. Her eyes fell to Thomas, who was whimpering softly. Your little one sounds hungry, Delilah nodded, embarrassment coloring her cheeks. I haven't been able to feed him properly. Martha's expression softened with motherly understanding. I have more than enough for both, she said simply. If you'd like, I can nurse him while you eat and rest. Tears sprang to Delilah's eyes at the unexpected kindness. I don't know how to thank you. No need, Martha said, gently taking Thomas from Delilah's arms. We all need help sometimes. While Martha fed Thomas, Daniel and Luke spoke in hushed tones by the door. Delilah sat at the table, gratefully accepting the bowl of stew Martha had prepared. The warm food revitalized her, and for the first time in days, she felt the crushing weight of fear lift slightly from her shoulders. After the meal, Martha showed Delilah to a small bedroom where she could clean up and change into one of Martha's dresses. The simple cotton garment felt like luxury after days in the same dirt-stained clothes. When she emerged, Luke and Daniel were poring over a map spread on the table. They looked up as she entered, and something flickered in Luke's eyes, surprise, perhaps, at seeing her cleaned up and in fresh clothes. The moment passed quickly as he returned his attention to the map. Blackwater gang was spotted near Green River 2 days ago, Daniel was saying. They've been working their way south. My guess is they're heading for the border. Not if they're still looking for Mrs. Nolan and the gold, Luke replied. They're not the type to leave loose ends. Delilah approached the table, Thomas now sleeping peacefully in her arms after being fed. The gold isn't worth dying for, she said quietly. I just want Thomas to be safe. Luke's expression softened as he looked at her. That's why we're going to get you to Monticello. Sheriff Jenkins, there is a good man. He can arrange protection for you until we deal with Blackwater. You're not thinking of going after them alone, Delilah asked, alarm evident in her voice. Not alone, Luke assured her. I've got deputies waiting in Monticello. We've been tracking Blackwater for months. This might be our best chance to finally bring them to justice. Daniel rolled up the map. You can stay here tonight, rest up. I'll ride with you to Monticello tomorrow, safer with 2 guns. Martha, who had been listening from across the room, stepped forward. I've made up the spare room for you, Mrs. Nolan. There's a cradle you can use for the baby. Please call me Delilah, she insisted, and I can't thank you enough for your kindness. Later that evening, after Thomas had been settled in the borrowed cradle, Delilah stepped outside onto the porch. The night air was cool, the sky ablaze with stars. She wrapped her arms around herself, lost in thought, when she heard the door open behind her. Cold out, Luke said, draping a blanket over her shoulders. You should be resting. Delilah clutched the blanket gratefully. I needed some air and time to think. She turned to face him. I never properly thanked you for saving us. Luke leaned against the porch railing, his profile strong against the starlit sky. You don't need to thank me, Mrs. Nolan. Delilah, she corrected gently. After all we've been through, I think formalities seem a bit unnecessary. A small smile played at the corner of his mouth. Delilah, then. He was quiet for a moment. I'm sorry about your husband. The simple statement, spoken with such genuine sympathy, broke something inside her. Tears welled in her eyes, and before she could stop herself, a sob escaped her lips. Luke hesitated only a moment before stepping forward and enfolding her in his strong arms. "It's all right," he murmured into her hair as she cried against his chest. "You're safe now, you and Thomas both." For several minutes, Delilah allowed herself the luxury of being held, of sharing her grief with someone who seemed to understand it. When she finally pulled away, wiping her eyes, she felt both embarrassed and lightened. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't mean to." "Don't apologize," Luke said firmly. "You've been through hell. Anyone would break." She looked up at him, really studying his face for the first time, the kind eyes that had seen too much, the lines around his mouth that spoke of both smiles and sorrows. "Why did you become a marshal?" she asked softly. Luke's gaze moved to the distant horizon. "My father was a lawman, taught me and my brother that a man's worth is measured by how he protects those who can't protect themselves." His voice grew rougher. "After Jake, my brother, was killed, wearing this badge became about more than just following in my father's footsteps. It became personal." Delilah nodded, understanding all too well how quickly life could become divided into before and after. "And now, when you've caught Blackwater." Luke looked down at her, his expression unreadable in the darkness. "Haven't thought that far ahead," he admitted. "Been chasing them so long, sometimes I forget there might be a life waiting afterward." An owl hooted in the distance, breaking the moment between them. Luke straightened, taking a step back. "You should get some rest," he said, his voice returning to its professional tone. "We've got a long ride to Monticello tomorrow." Delilah nodded, suddenly aware of how close they'd been standing, how intimate their conversation had become. "Good night, Luke," she said, turning toward the door. "Good night, Delilah," he replied softly. "Sleep well." As she returned to her room, Delilah found herself thinking not of the dangers that still pursued them, but of the man who had pledged to keep them safe, a man whose gentle strength was beginning to feel like something she could lean on. The Johnson household stirred to life before dawn, with Martha preparing a hearty breakfast while Daniel saddled the horses. Delilah fed and changed Thomas, marveling at how much better they both felt after just one night of proper rest and care. "I've packed some provisions for the journey," Martha said, handing Delilah a bundle wrapped in cloth, "and some clean cloths for the baby." "I don't know how I'll ever repay your kindness," Delilah said, accepting the bundle with heartfelt gratitude. Martha smiled warmly. "You just keep that little one safe. That's payment enough for me." She hesitated, then added in a softer voice, "And perhaps look after Luke a bit. He's a good man, but he's been alone too long, carrying too many burdens." Before Delilah could respond, the door opened and Luke entered, already dressed for travel. His eyes found Delilah immediately, a brief smile crossing his features before his expression returned to its usual vigilance. "Daniel's ready with the horses," he announced. "We should get moving." "It's about a day's ride to Monticello if we push hard." Martha handed Luke a package of food. "You make sure they eat properly on the trail," she instructed with motherly authority. "Yes, madam," Luke replied with a hint of amusement. He turned to Delilah. "Ready." Delilah nodded, securing Thomas in the improved sling Martha had fashioned for her. The baby gurgled contentedly, his belly full and his world momentarily at peace. Outside, Daniel waited with 3 horses, his own sturdy bay, Luke's Appaloosa, and a gentle-looking mare for Delilah. "Thought you might be more comfortable on your own mount," Daniel explained. "Daisy here is as steady as they come. She'll take good care of you and the little one." Luke helped Delilah mount, his hands strong and sure as he boosted her into the saddle. Their eyes met briefly as he adjusted the stirrups for her, and Delilah felt a flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with anxiety. With final thanks and goodbyes to Martha, they set off at a steady pace, Daniel leading the way with Luke riding close beside Delilah, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon for any signs of danger. The morning passed uneventfully as they traversed the rugged landscape. Daniel, riding slightly ahead, occasionally pointed out landmarks or shared stories about the territory. Luke remained mostly silent, his attention divided between the trail and Delilah, ready to offer assistance whenever the path grew difficult. They stopped around midday near a small creek to rest the horses and eat. Daniel built a small fire to brew coffee while Luke helped Delilah dismount. "How are you holding up?" he asked, his hands lingering on her waist a moment longer than necessary. "Better than I expected," she admitted. "Daisy is indeed as steady as Daniel promised." Luke smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his serious face. "Good. We've made good time so far. Should reach Monticello by nightfall." As they sat eating the bread and dried meat Martha had packed, Thomas began to fuss. Delilah rocked him gently, but his cries only grew louder. "Might be the heat," Daniel suggested. "There's some shade over by those rocks, might be cooler for the little fella." Delilah nodded gratefully and carried Thomas to the shaded area Daniel had indicated, a small outcropping that provided relief from the midday sun. As she settled against the cool rock, loosening the baby's swaddling to help him cool down, a sudden movement caught her eye. A rattlesnake, disturbed from its resting place, coiled not 3 feet from where she sat. Fear froze her in place, her arms tightening instinctively around Thomas, whose cries had momentarily paused. The snake's tail began its ominous warning, the distinctive rattle sending ice through Delilah's veins. "Don't move," Luke's voice came low and steady from behind her. "Just stay perfectly still." Delilah didn't dare turn to look at him, her eyes fixed on the snake's triangular head as it swayed slightly, assessing the threat. In one fluid motion, Luke stepped to her side, his revolver appearing in his hand as if by magic. The shot cracked through the air, precise and deadly. The snake's head exploded in a spray of dust and blood, its body writhing briefly before falling still. Thomas, startled by the gunshot, began wailing in earnest. Delilah's legs gave way beneath her as delayed shock set in, and she sank to the ground, clutching her baby. Luke was beside her instantly, one arm around her shoulders. "You're all right," he assured her, his voice calm despite the tension in his body. "You're both all right." Daniel arrived moments later, rifle in hand. Seeing the dead snake, he let out a low whistle. "Clean shot, Luke, mighty clean." Luke didn't respond, his attention focused entirely on Delilah, whose breathing was coming in short, panicked gasps. "Breathe, Delilah," he instructed gently. "Deep breaths. You're safe." Gradually, her breathing steadied, though her hands still trembled as she held Thomas close. The baby's cries subsided into hiccuping sobs. "I didn't see it," she whispered, her voice unsteady. "I could have, Thomas could have. But you didn't, and he's fine," Luke said firmly. No sense dwelling on what didn't happen. His arm tightened briefly around her shoulders. "Though I admit you nearly stopped my heart." The simple admission, spoken in that steady voice, helped anchor Delilah back to reality. She looked up at him, seeing the concern in his eyes, concern that went beyond professional duty. "Thank you," she said simply. "You keep saving us." A shadow of a smile crossed his face. "I made a promise, didn't I, to protect you both?" Daniel cleared his throat. "We should get moving," he said. "That shot might have carried farther than we'd like." Luke helped Delilah to her feet, his hand lingering on her elbow as if reluctant to break contact. They quickly packed up their small camp and mounted, setting off at a slightly faster pace than before. As they rode, Delilah found herself glancing more frequently at Luke, seeing him in a new light. It wasn't just his quick reflexes or his skill with a gun that had saved them, it was his constant vigilance, his unwavering attention to her and Thomas's safety. In a world that had recently shown her nothing but cruelty, his steadfast protection was like a beacon in a storm. The afternoon wore on, the sun beating down mercilessly as they traveled through increasingly arid terrain. Thomas, worn out from his earlier fright, slept peacefully against Delilah's chest, occasionally stirring when the trail grew rough. Daniel rode slightly ahead, leading them through the safest paths, while Luke remained at Delilah's side, occasionally offering water from his canteen or adjusting her horse's reins when the mare grew skittish at a passing jackrabbit. They had just entered a narrow canyon, the towering red rock walls providing some relief from the sun, when Daniel suddenly raised his hand in a signal to stop. Luke immediately moved his horse in front of Delilah's, his body tense as he scanned their surroundings. "What is it?" Delilah whispered, fear clutching at her throat. "Not sure," Luke replied, his voice low. "Daniel's spotted something." Daniel gestured for them to dismount and take cover behind a large boulder. Luke helped Delilah down quickly, guiding her and Thomas to the shelter of the rock. "Stay here," he instructed, drawing his revolver. "Don't move until I come back for you." Before Delilah could protest, he disappeared around the boulder, moving with a silent grace that belied his size. She held Thomas close, her heart pounding as she strained to hear what was happening. Minutes passed like hours. Thomas began to squirm, sensing his mother's tension. Delilah gently rocked him, humming softly to keep him quiet, all the while listening for any sign of Luke's return. Finally, she heard footsteps approaching. Luke appeared, his expression grim. "Riders coming through the canyon," he said quietly. "5 of them, and from Daniel's description, it sounds like the Blackwater gang." Delilah's blood turned to ice. "How did they find us?" "They might not have," Luke replied. "This canyon's one of the main routes through these parts. Could be coincidence." But his tone suggested he didn't believe in such coincidences. "What do we do?" she asked, struggling to keep her voice steady. "There's a side trail about 50 yards back, leads up out of the canyon. Daniel's going to create a diversion right out and draw their attention. Meanwhile, you and I slip away up that trail." Delilah shook her head vehemently. "No, it's too dangerous for Daniel. I won't have another death on my conscience." "Daniel knows these lands better than anyone," Luke assured her. "He can outride those scoundrels and circle back to Monticello. It's you they're after, and that means you and Thomas are the ones we need to get to safety." Before she could argue further, Daniel appeared, leading the horses. "They're about 10 minutes behind," he reported. "We need to move now." Luke turned to Delilah, his expression brooking no argument. "We're going to do this, and we're going to do it now. I made a promise to keep you safe, and I intend to keep it." Something in his unwavering certainty gave Delilah the courage she needed. She nodded, allowing Luke to help her back onto Daisy's saddle. Daniel clasped Luke's hand briefly. "See you in Monticello," he said with forced cheerfulness. "Be careful," Luke replied, his expression grave. "These men don't play by any rules." Daniel nodded, then mounted his bay and rode off down the canyon, deliberately making enough noise to attract attention. Luke led Delilah's horse back along the trail until they reached a barely visible path winding up the canyon wall. The going was slow and treacherous, with loose rocks threatening to give way under the horse's hooves. Delilah held Thomas tightly, her body tense with fear that his cries might give them away. As they climbed higher, they heard shouts echoing through the canyon below. Daniel had encountered the riders. Gunshots followed, the sound reverberating off the stone walls. "Daniel," Delilah gasped, twisting in her saddle to look back. "Keep moving," Luke urged, though his own face was drawn with concern. "Trust him." They continued climbing until they reached a ridge overlooking the canyon. From their vantage point, they could see 5 riders pursuing a lone figure on horseback, Daniel, racing down the canyon at breakneck speed. As they watched, Daniel rounded a bend and disappeared from sight, his pursuers close behind. "He'll be all right," Luke said, as much to convince himself as Delilah. "Daniel knows what he's doing. Come on, we need to keep moving." They rode along the ridge, keeping to the tree line to avoid being silhouetted against the sky. The sun was beginning to set, painting the landscape in fiery hues that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. As darkness fell, Luke finally called a halt in a small clearing sheltered by juniper trees. "We'll rest here for a few hours," he said, helping Delilah dismount. "Can't risk a fire, though." Delilah nodded, too exhausted to argue. Her muscles ached from the long day's ride, and worry for Daniel weighed heavily on her heart. Thomas, surprisingly, had remained quiet through most of their flight, but now he began to fuss, hungry and uncomfortable. Luke unsaddled the horses, while Delilah found a soft patch of grass to sit with Thomas. She fed him as best she could, grateful that her milk had returned somewhat thanks to Martha's care and her own improved diet. When Luke finished with the horses, he joined her, offering jerky and dried fruit from his saddlebags. "Not much of a dinner," he apologized. "It's more than I had in the cave," Delilah replied, accepting the food gratefully. "How much farther to Monticello?" "If we start at first light, we should be there by mid-morning," Luke said, settling beside her with his back against a tree trunk. Sheriff Jenkins will keep you safe while I gather my deputies to go after Blackwater. Delilah looked at him sharply. You're still planning to pursue them? Even after today, especially after today, Luke replied, his voice hardening. They're getting bolder, more desperate. They need to be stopped before more innocent people get hurt. The unspoken fear hung between them that Daniel might already be among those hurt or worse. Delilah reached out impulsively, laying her hand on Luke's arm. Be careful, she said softly. Thomas and we need you to come back. In the dim starlight, she saw something flicker in Luke's eyes, surprise, followed by a warmth that had nothing to do with duty or obligation. He covered her hand with his own, his touch gentle despite the calluses that spoke of hard work and harder living. I'll come back, he promised, his voice low and intense. Count on it. They sat in companionable silence as the night deepened around them. Thomas eventually fell asleep against Delilah's chest, his steady breathing a comforting rhythm in the quiet night. Despite her exhaustion, Delilah found herself fighting sleep, not wanting to waste these peaceful moments with Luke. You should rest, he said, noticing her drooping eyelids. I'll keep watch. You need sleep too, she protested weakly. Luke smiled in the darkness. I'll wake you in a few hours to take your turn. Both knew it was a lie. He had no intention of sleeping while potential danger lurked nearby, but Delilah appreciated the gesture. She settled more comfortably against the tree, Thomas secure in her arms, and let her eyes close. Just before sleep claimed her, she felt something warm and heavy drape across her shoulders Luke's coat. She realized with drowsy gratitude. The gesture, small but significant, followed her into dreams that, for once, weren't plagued by nightmares. Dawn broke in a symphony of birdsong and pale light filtering through the juniper branches. Delilah awoke to find Luke already up, checking the horses and scanning the surrounding area for any signs of danger. Morning, he said when he noticed her stirring. Sleep well. Delilah nodded, surprised to realize she had indeed slept soundly. Thomas was just beginning to wake, making the small grunting noises that preceded his hunger cries. Luke approached, offering his canteen and the last of Martha's bread. Quick breakfast, then we should move out, he said. I want to reach Monticello before the day gets too hot. As they prepared to leave, Delilah noticed Luke frequently checking the back trail, his expression tense. Are you expecting trouble? She asked, securing Thomas in his sling. Always expecting trouble, Luke replied with a grim smile. That's how I've stayed alive this long. He helped her mount Daisy, then swung up onto his own horse. Stay close, the trail gets rough in places. They rode at a steady pace through the increasingly rocky terrain. Monticello lay in a valley surrounded by mountains, and the approach from their current position involved navigating several steep descents. There, Luke said mid-morning, pointing to a cluster of buildings nestled in the distance. Monticello. Not much to look at, but it's got law, which is what we need right now. Relief flooded through Delilah at the sight of the small settlement. After days of fear and flight, the promise of safety, even temporary, was overwhelming. As they drew closer to the town, however, Luke's posture grew increasingly tense. He repeatedly checked his gun, his eyes constantly scanning the road ahead. What's wrong? Delilah asked, sensing his unease. Not sure, he admitted. Just a feeling, something's off. He urged his horse slightly ahead of hers. Stay behind me as we ride in. They entered Monticello at a cautious pace. The town consisted of one main street with various businesses, a general store, saloon, smithy, and at the far end, a small building with a sign declaring it the sheriff's office. What struck Delilah immediately was the emptiness. Few people walked the streets, and those who did moved quickly, heads down, avoiding eye contact. Where is everyone? She whispered. Luke's face was grim. That's what I'd like to know. He guided them directly toward the sheriff's office, his hand never far from his revolver. As they reached the building, the door opened, and a man stepped out, tall and lean, with a star pinned to his vest. His eyes widened momentarily at the sight of Luke before his expression settled into careful neutrality. Marshal Wright, he said, nodding. Wasn't expecting you for another day or two. Sheriff Jenkins, Luke replied, dismounting but keeping one hand near his gun. Ran into some trouble on the trail, had to take a detour. His eyes swept the quiet street. Town seems quiet. Jenkins shifted uncomfortably. Just one of those days, I reckon. Luke helped Delilah dismount, keeping her slightly behind him. This is Mrs. Nolan and her son. They need protection. Blackwater gang's after them. Jenkins paled visibly at the mention of the gang. Ah, well, that's a problem. Luke's expression hardened. What aren't you telling me, Jenkins? Before the sheriff could answer, the saloon doors across the street burst open, and 4 men strode out, rough-looking men with guns prominently displayed on their hips. At their head was a tall man with a shock of white blonde hair and cold blue eyes that fixed immediately on Delilah. Well, well, the blonde man drawled. Look what the marshal dragged in, the widow Nolan, if I'm not mistaken. Luke pushed Delilah fully behind him, his gun appearing in his hand with startling speed. Jeb Blackwater, he said, his voice deadly calm. Fancy meeting you here. Blackwater smiled, a predatory baring of teeth. We've been expecting you, Marshal. Your friend Daniel was most informative before he expired. Delilah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Thomas, startled by the sudden tension, began to cry. You're lying, Luke said, though doubt flickered across his face. Am I? Blackwater chuckled. Sheriff, why don't you tell the marshal what happens to folks who cross the Blackwater gang? Jenkins' eyes dropped to the ground, shame written across his features. I'm sorry, Luke, he mumbled. They came yesterday, got my deputy, said they'd burn the town if we didn't cooperate. Understanding dawned on Luke's face. You sold us out. Jenkins didn't deny it, his silence confirmation enough. Blackwater stepped forward, his men fanning out behind him. Now, let's make this simple. The woman and the brat come with us. You can ride away, Marshal. No one else needs to die today. Not happening, Luke replied, his voice like steel. Mrs. Nolan and her son are under my protection. Your protection? Blackwater laughed coldly. Look around, Marshal. You're outnumbered, outgunned, and your only ally has already turned tail. Luke didn't take his eyes off Blackwater. Delilah, he said quietly, when I say run, take Thomas and get inside the sheriff's office. Lock the door. Luke, no, she whispered, terror gripping her. They'll kill you. Better me than you and Thomas, he replied. Promise me you'll run. Before she could answer, hoofbeats sounded from the edge of town, multiple riders approaching fast. Everyone's attention momentarily shifted to the newcomers. Looks like we've got more company, Blackwater observed, his hand moving to his gun. 6 riders thundered into town, rifles raised. At their lead was a familiar figure, Daniel Johnson, bloodied but very much alive. Sorry I'm late, Luke. Daniel called as he and his companions reined in their horses, weapons trained on Blackwater and his men. Had to gather some friends from the neighboring ranches. Relief and hope surged through Delilah. Luke's expression remained focused, but a slight smile tugged at his lips. Seems the odds just changed, Blackwater, he observed coolly. Jeb Blackwater's face contorted with rage. This changes nothing. I've come too far to let that gold slip away. With a roar of fury, he drew his gun, aiming not at Luke but at Delilah. Luke moved with incredible speed, shoving Delilah down and firing in the same motion. His bullet caught Blackwater in the shoulder, spinning him around. Chaos erupted as both sides opened fire. Luke dragged Delilah and Thomas toward the shelter of the sheriff's office porch, bullets splintering the wood around them. Sheriff Jenkins, finding his courage at last, provided covering fire from the doorway. Get inside, Luke shouted, pushing Delilah toward the door. Stay down. Once she was safely inside with Thomas, Luke turned back to the gunfight. Daniel and his men had taken positions behind water troughs and hitching posts, exchanging fire with Blackwater's gang. Despite his wounded shoulder, Jeb Blackwater fought like a cornered wolf, firing wildly while shouting orders to his men. Kill them all, he bellowed. Burn this whole town if you have to. From her position inside the sheriff's office, Delilah could see the battle raging through the window. She clutched Thomas tightly, trying to shield him from the noise and danger. Her eyes remained fixed on Luke as he moved with deadly precision, each shot finding its mark. One of Blackwater's men fell, then another. The remaining outlaws began to waver, clearly not expecting such fierce resistance. Daniel's men pressed their advantage, forcing the outlaws to retreat toward the saloon. Jeb Blackwater, seeing his men faltering, made a desperate dash for his horse. Luke spotted him and gave chase, firing as he ran. Blackwater returned fire over his shoulder, one bullet grazing Luke's arm but failing to slow him. Reaching his horse, Blackwater swung himself into the saddle, kicking the animal into a gallop. Luke seized the reins of a nearby mount and pursued, determination etched on his features as the two men thundered out of town in a cloud of dust. The remaining gunfire gradually died down as Daniel and his men subdued or scattered the other outlaws. Sheriff Jenkins, emboldened by the turning tide, emerged from his office to help round up the survivors. Delilah stood in the doorway, Thomas wailing in her arms, her eyes fixed on the distant dust cloud that marked Luke's pursuit of Blackwater. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as she waited, desperately hoping to see Luke return victorious. Finally, a lone rider appeared on the horizon, moving at a steady pace rather than a gallop. As he drew closer, Delilah could make out Luke's familiar silhouette, slumped slightly but upright in the saddle. Daniel rode out to meet him, returning moments later with Luke beside him. Even from a distance, Delilah could see blood staining Luke's shirt, but he was alive wonderfully, blessedly alive. She ran toward him as he dismounted, heedless of the curious stares from townspeople now cautiously emerging from their homes. Luke caught her with his good arm, holding her and Thomas close as if afraid they might vanish. "Are you hurt?" Delilah demanded, her free hand hovering over the bloodstain on his arm. "Just a graze," Luke assured her, his eyes never leaving her face. "Blackwater won't be troubling anyone again." Understanding dawned in her eyes. "You killed him," Luke nodded grimly. "He didn't leave me much choice, tried to ambush me in the ravine outside town." His expression softened as he looked at Thomas, who had finally calmed in the aftermath of the gunfight. "You're both safe now, it's over." Relief washed over Delilah in a dizzying wave. She swayed slightly and Luke's arm tightened around her waist, supporting her. "Let's get you somewhere quiet," he suggested, guiding her toward the small hotel at the end of the street. "You've been through enough for one day." Sheriff Jenkins approached, his expression a mixture of shame and relief. "Marshal, I don't know what to say. We thought Daniel was dead when he didn't return, when Blackwater arrived with his men." "Save it, Jenkins," Luke said, his voice tired but lacking real anger. "Fear makes cowards of most men. What matters is you found your courage when it counted." Jenkins nodded gratefully. "Hotel's been prepared for Mrs. Nolan. Dr. Wilson's waiting there to check on you both." Luke thanked him with a nod, then continued guiding Delilah toward the hotel, his hand a steady presence at her back. The hotel was modest but clean, with a small lobby and a concerned-looking proprietress, who immediately ushered them upstairs to a prepared room. The doctor, a gruff older man with kind eyes, was indeed waiting to examine both Luke's wound and Thomas's general health. "Baby's fine," he pronounced after a thorough check. "Bit underweight perhaps, but nothing that good care won't fix." He turned to Luke, who was sitting patiently on a chair. "You, on the other hand, Marshal, need stitches." Luke submitted to the doctor's ministrations with stoic silence, wincing only slightly as the needle pulled through his skin. Delilah sat nearby, Thomas sleeping peacefully in her arms, her eyes never leaving Luke's face. When the doctor finally left, promising to return in the morning to check on Luke's wound, a comfortable silence fell between them. Luke moved to the window, looking out at the now peaceful town. "Daniel told me what happened after we separated," he said after a moment. Blackwater's men chased him for miles, but he managed to lose them in the high country. When he realized they were heading for Monticello, he gathered men from the surrounding ranches to come to our aid. "He saved us," Delilah said softly, "just as you did." Luke turned to face her, his expression serious. "What will you do now? The threat's gone, but starting over won't be easy." Delilah considered the question. For so long, her only thought had been survival, keeping Thomas safe from Blackwater's men. Now, faced with a future free from that immediate danger, she found herself uncertain. "I don't know," she admitted. "Return to our homestead, perhaps, though the memory's there." She trailed off, the thought of facing the place where Robert had been murdered too painful to contemplate. Luke moved closer, sitting beside her on the small sofa. "You don't have to decide right away. You're welcome to stay in Monticello as long as you need." "And you?" Delilah asked, suddenly afraid of his answer. Where will you go now that Blackwater is finished? Something flickered in Luke's eyes, uncertainty, perhaps, or a question he wasn't sure how to ask. I've been thinking about that, he said slowly. Been a marshal for 8 years now, chasing Blackwater for the last 6 months. Maybe it's time for something different. Hope bloomed in Delilah's chest, though she tried to temper it. What would you do instead? Luke's gaze dropped to his hands, then lifted to meet hers directly. I've got some land about 20 miles south of here, good grazing land with a creek running through it. Built a cabin there a few years back, thinking someday I might, well, settle down. He paused, seemed to gather his courage. It's not much, but it could be a place for a fresh start. For both of you, if you wanted. Delilah's breath caught in her throat. Luke, are you asking? I know it's sudden, he said quickly. And I'm not expecting anything, just offering a safe place as a friend. His eyes told a different story, however, one of growing feelings he was trying hard to keep in check. You've been through too much to make any big decisions right now. Delilah studied his face, seeing beyond the Marshal's stoic exterior to the man beneath, a man who had risked everything to protect her and Thomas, who had shown kindness and respect when she had known only fear and desperation. When I first saw you outside that cave, she said softly, I was terrified. I didn't know if I could trust anyone ever again. She shifted Thomas to one arm, her other hand reaching out to touch Luke's. But you promised to protect us, and you kept that promise even at the risk of your own life. Luke's hand turned to hold hers, his touch gentle but sure. I meant what I said, Delilah. I'll protect you both. Always. The simple repetition of his original promise, spoken now not in the heat of danger but in the quiet aftermath of safety, carried a deeper meaning that neither could ignore. I think, Delilah said carefully, that Thomas and I would very much like to see this land of yours, this fresh start you mentioned. A smile slowly spread across Luke's face, transforming it from handsome to breathtaking. Really? Delilah nodded, her own smile growing to match his. Really? But Luke, I need you to understand something. Her expression grew more serious. I'm not looking for someone to replace Robert. That wouldn't be fair to anyone, not to his memory, not to you, and certainly not to me. I would never presume to replace him, Luke assured her. But perhaps in time we might build something new, something that honors what came before while looking toward the future. Thomas stirred in Delilah's arms, blinking up at them both with curious eyes. Luke tentatively reached out, offering his finger to the baby's tiny hand. Thomas gripped it immediately, his little fingers curling around Luke's larger one with surprising strength. He's got a good grip, Luke observed, his voice softening with wonder, strong like his mother. The simple compliment, spoken with such genuine admiration, touched Delilah deeply. This man saw her not as a helpless widow to be pitied or a burden to be shouldered, but as a woman of strength and value. We'll take it slowly, she said, looking from Thomas to Luke. Day by day. Luke nodded, understanding and patience in his eyes. Day by day, he agreed. As the evening shadows lengthened across Monticello, Delilah found herself, for the first time in what felt like forever, looking forward to tomorrow. The road ahead would not be easy. Grief and healing rarely followed a straight path, but with Luke beside them, she believed that she and Thomas might find not just safety, but happiness as well. And that, after everything they had endured, was a promise worth holding on to. 2 weeks later, Delilah stood on the porch of Luke's cabin, watching as he guided the wagon up the final stretch of the winding path that led to his property. Thomas slept peacefully in her arms, content after his mid-morning feeding. The cabin was exactly as Luke had described it, modest but sturdy, built with care on a gentle rise overlooking a creek that bubbled cheerfully through the property. Beyond the creek stretched acres of good grazing land, currently empty but holding the promise of future life. Luke had spent the past 2 weeks finalizing his affairs in Monticello, officially resigning his position as U.S. Marshal, while Delilah and Thomas stayed safely at the hotel. The town had quickly warmed to them, especially after the truth about Blackwater's reign of terror became widely known. Martha and Daniel Johnson had visited before they left, bringing supplies and offering ongoing friendship. Martha had taken Delilah aside, her motherly eyes kind but knowing. He's a good man, she had said simply. The kind that comes along rarely in this life. Delilah hadn't pretended to misunderstand. I know, she had replied. But it's complicated. Martha had patted her hand gently. The worthwhile things usually are, dear. Now, as Luke pulled the wagon to a stop and secured the horses, Delilah felt a flutter of nervous anticipation. This was the beginning of their fresh start, as Luke had called it. Not as husband and wife, not yet, but as two people bound by circumstance and growing affection, finding their way forward together. "Welcome home," Luke said, approaching the porch with a smile that held both joy and uncertainty. "What do you think?" Delilah looked around at the rugged beauty of the land, the distant mountains, the clear creek, the wildflowers dotting the meadow. "It's beautiful," she said honestly. "Peaceful." Relief flashed across Luke's face. "It needs work," he admitted. "Been away too long. But I figured we could make improvements together, whatever you think would make it more comfortable for you and Thomas." The consideration in his words touched her. He wasn't simply offering shelter, he was inviting her to help create a home, their home, eventually, if things progressed as they both quietly hoped. "I'd like that," she said, smiling. "Though I warn you, I have very strong opinions about curtains." Luke laughed, the sound warm and genuine. "I'll consider myself warned." He gestured to the wagon. "Let's get your things inside before this little one wakes up demanding attention." They settled into a routine over the following days. Luke worked from sunrise to sunset, repairing fences, clearing land, and preparing for the small herd of cattle he planned to purchase. Delilah kept the cabin, cooking meals and caring for Thomas, but also finding time to plant a small garden and add touches that gradually transformed the bachelor's quarters into a family home. They were careful with each other, mindful of boundaries both spoken and unspoken. Luke took to sleeping in the small bunkhouse adjacent to the main cabin, insisting that Delilah and Thomas have the house to themselves. "I've spent more nights under the stars than in a proper bed anyway," he said when she protested. "This is luxury compared to the trail." But as the weeks passed, the careful distance between them began to diminish. Meals stretched longer as they talked about their days, shared stories from their pasts, and made plans for the future. When Thomas fussed during the night, Luke would sometimes appear at the door, offering to walk with him so Delilah could rest. It was during one such night, nearly a month after they'd arrived at the ranch, that something shifted between them. Thomas had been particularly fussy, his first tooth beginning to make its presence known. After hours of failed attempts to soothe him, Delilah had opened the door to find Luke already standing there, his hair rumpled from sleep, but his eyes alert. "Heard the little fella from the bunkhouse," he explained, holding out his arms. "Thought you might need a break." Gratefully, Delilah had handed over the cranky baby. To her amazement, Thomas had immediately quieted in Luke's strong arms, his tiny head nestling against the man's broad shoulder. "How did you do that?" she asked, equal parts impressed and indignant that her hours of rocking had been rendered unnecessary in seconds. Luke smiled, gently patting Thomas's back. "My sister had 4 little ones. I used to help when her husband was away working the railroad. Guess I picked up a few tricks." "You never mentioned a sister," Delilah observed, suddenly realizing how little she knew about Luke's family beyond his father and the brother who'd been killed. "Sarah lives in Colorado now," he explained. "Haven't seen her in a couple of years, though we write when we can." A shadow crossed his face. "After Jake was killed, I got focused, let a lot of things slide that I shouldn't have." Delilah understood all too well how grief could narrow one's world, reducing it to just the essentials of survival. "Maybe you could write to her," she suggested. "Tell her about the ranch, about us." It was the first time either of them had acknowledged that there was an us to speak of, and the word hung in the air between them, full of possibility. Luke's eyes met hers, warm and questioning. "And what would I tell her about us exactly?" Delilah's heart quickened, but she didn't look away. "That we're figuring it out, that it's a journey, not a destination." A slow smile spread across Luke's face. "I like that," he said softly. Thomas, now sound asleep on Luke's shoulder, made a small sighing noise. Luke carefully transferred him back to Delilah, their arms brushing in the exchange. "Thank you," she said, meaning more than just the help with Thomas. Luke nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Good night, Delilah," he said, his voice gentle. He turned to leave, then paused at the door. "For what it's worth, I'm enjoying the journey." With that, he slipped out into the night, leaving Delilah with a sleeping baby and a heart full of growing certainty. The seasons changed, summer giving way to the golden beauty of autumn. The small herd of cattle Luke had purchased thrived on the lush grass, and the garden Delilah had planted yielded a bountiful harvest. Thomas grew stronger and more active each day, crawling everywhere and pulling himself up to stand while holding onto furniture, his baby babble filling the cabin with joy. As winter approached, Luke began working on expanding the cabin, adding a second bedroom and enlarging the main living area. Delilah helped where she could, learning to saw boards and hammer nails under Luke's patient instruction. "You're a natural," he said one afternoon as they worked together to hang a door. "Might have to hire you out as a carpenter." Delilah laughed, wiping sweat from her brow. "I think I'll stick to gardening and cooking, thank you very much. Though I must admit, there's something satisfying about building something with your own hands." Luke nodded, his expression turning thoughtful. "That's what we're doing here, isn't it? Building something together." The simple observation carried deeper meaning, and they both knew it. Day by day, they were building not just a home, but a life, a family, formed not by blood or law but by choice and growing love. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink, Thomas already asleep inside, Luke reached over and took Delilah's hand in his. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice slightly rougher than usual, "about us, about the future." Delilah's heart quickened, but she kept her voice steady. "And what have you been thinking, Marshal Wright?" He smiled at the teasing use of his former title. "I've been thinking that I don't want to sleep in the bunkhouse anymore." The directness of his statement surprised a laugh out of her. "Is that so?" "It is," he confirmed, his thumb tracing gentle circles on the back of her hand. "But more than that, I've been thinking that I want to do this properly." He turned to face her fully, his expression serious despite the gentle humor that had preceded it. "I love you, Delilah. I think I started falling in love with you that first day, when you came out of that cave, scared but so brave, holding Thomas like he was the most precious thing in the world." Tears welled in Delilah's eyes, unexpected but not unwelcome. "Luke, you don't have to say anything," he assured her quickly. "I know it's been less than a year since you lost Robert. I know that grief has its own timeline. I just wanted you to know where I stand." He squeezed her hand gently. "I meant what I said that first day. I'll protect you both always. Whether that's as a friend or someday, God willing, as something more." Delilah looked at this man, this good, patient, honorable man who had saved her life in more ways than one, and felt the last walls around her heart begin to crumble. "I loved Robert," she said quietly. "A part of me always will. He gave me Thomas, and for that alone I would honor his memory forever." She took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "But what I feel for you, Luke, is different. It's not a replacement or a substitute. It's new and unexpected and wonderful." Hope blazed in Luke's eyes. "Delilah, are you saying?" "I'm saying that I love you too," she whispered, the words both terrifying and liberating, "and that I don't want you sleeping in the bunkhouse anymore either." Luke's smile could have outshone the setting sun. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, he leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers in a kiss that was gentle but full of promise. Delilah responded in kind, her free hand coming up to rest against his cheek, feeling the roughness of his beard against her palm. When they finally broke apart, both slightly breathless, Luke rested his forehead against hers. "I was thinking," he said softly, "that there's a circuit preacher coming through Monticello next month, if you're ready, that is." Delilah's heart soared at the indirect proposal. "I think," she replied, matching his tone, "that Thomas and I would both like that very much." They were married on the first Sunday of December, with snow dusting the ground outside the small church in Monticello. Daniel stood as Luke's best man while Martha held Thomas, now sporting two tiny teeth and an infectious grin. The circuit preacher, a jovial man with a booming voice, pronounced them husband and wife with evident pleasure. As Luke kissed his bride, Thomas let out a delighted squeal that set the small congregation laughing. "I think he approves," Luke said as they broke apart, his eyes shining with happiness. Of course he does, Delilah replied, reaching for her son. He's been trying to get us together for months. They celebrated with a modest reception at the hotel, townspeople and neighboring ranchers coming to offer congratulations and gifts. Sheriff Jenkins, now a firm friend, presented them with a handsome clock for their mantle. Daniel and Martha gave them a beautiful quilt Martha had made, the pattern representing intertwined lives. As evening fell and the celebration continued, Luke drew Delilah aside to a quiet corner. "Happy?" he asked, his arm warm around her waist. Delilah looked around at the gathering, at Thomas being passed from one admiring townswoman to another, at the friends they had made, at the life they were building together. "More than I ever thought possible," she answered honestly. Luke kissed her temples softly. "There's something I wanted to give you, a wedding present." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch. "This is yours." Delilah opened the pouch, gasping when she saw the gold dust inside Robert's gold, the very thing that had brought such tragedy into their lives. "How did you?" "Found it when we went back to your homestead to collect your belongings," Luke explained. "It was hidden exactly where you said Robert had put it. I've been holding it for you, waiting for the right time." Tears welled in Delilah's eyes. "I don't want it," she whispered. "It's caused nothing but pain." Luke nodded, understanding. "I thought you might feel that way. That's why I've already spoken to Daniel about using it to establish a school here in Monticello. Seemed fitting, something good coming from something painful." Gratitude and love swelled in Delilah's heart. This man understood her, perhaps better than she understood herself sometimes. "It's perfect," she said, leaning into his embrace. "Robert would have liked that. He always said education was the future of the West." "Smart man," Luke observed. "He must have been to win your heart." "I was blessed," Delilah said softly, "to find true love twice in one lifetime." They returned to their ranch the following day, now officially a family in the eyes of the law as well as in their hearts. The winter passed in a cocoon of domestic happiness, the cold keeping them close to home and to each other. Luke proved to be as gentle and considerate a husband as Delilah had imagined, while she blossomed in the security of his love. Thomas thrived under their joint care, growing more adventurous by the day. By spring, he was taking his first wobbly steps, crying out with delight when Luke swung him high in celebration of this milestone. With the warming weather came more changes. The herd increased with the spring calving, keeping Luke busy from dawn to dusk. Delilah expanded her garden and began experimenting with preserving food for the coming winter. They hired a young man from town to help with the ranch work, allowing Luke more time with his family. In late summer, as they celebrated Thomas's first birthday with a small party that included Daniel and Martha Johnson, Delilah shared news of her own. "I believe," she told Luke that night as they lay together in the bedroom they now shared, "that Thomas will be a big brother by next spring." Luke's face registered shock, then joy so intense it brought tears to his eyes. "Really?" he asked, his hand tentatively moving to rest on her still flat stomach. Delilah nodded, covering his hand with hers. "Really?" He gathered her close, pressing kisses to her hair, her forehead, her lips. "I love you," he whispered fervently. "Both of you, all three of you now, I suppose." Delilah laughed, happiness bubbling up inside her. "And we love you, Marshal Wright." "Former Marshal," he corrected with a grin. "Current rancher, husband, father, and soon-to-be father again." "Quite a list of accomplishments," Delilah teased, "but you forgot one." "Oh, what's that?" She stroked his cheek tenderly. "Savior, protector, the man who kept his promise." Luke's expression softened. "To protect you both always," he recited. "Best promise I ever made." He placed his hand once more on her stomach. "And now it extends to this little one too." As they drifted to sleep in each other's arms, Delilah reflected on the journey that had brought them here from a desperate hiding place in a canyon cave to this home filled with love and hope. The path had been marked by danger and loss, but also by courage and kindness, by second chances and new beginnings. Outside, under the vast canopy of stars, the ranch slept peacefully, cattle in the pasture, horses in the barn, and inside the sturdy cabin, a family bound not just by blood and marriage, but by a promise kept through darkness into light. 5 years later, the Wright Ranch had prospered beyond even Luke's hopeful expectations. The original small herd had grown significantly, and the additional acreage Luke had purchased allowed for expanded operations. The cabin, too, had grown, with several rooms added to accommodate their growing family. Thomas, now 6 years old, had been joined by his brother James, 4, and sister Elizabeth, 2. The children thrived in the freedom of ranch life, under the watchful eyes of parents who balanced protection with encouragement to explore and grow. On this particular summer evening, Delilah stood on the porch, watching Luke teaching Thomas how to rope a practice dummy set up in the yard. James observed intently, waiting impatiently for his turn, while Elizabeth played contentedly with wooden blocks at Delilah's feet. "Easy now," Luke instructed, guiding Thomas's small hands. "Remember what I showed you about the wrist." Thomas's face was a mask of concentration as he swung the rope and let it fly. It fell short of the target, and he frowned in disappointment. "That was closer," Luke encouraged. "Try again." As Thomas prepared for another attempt, a rider appeared on the road leading to the ranch. Delilah shaded her eyes, recognizing Sheriff Jenkins from Monticello. "Company coming," she called to Luke, who looked up and waved in greeting to the approaching lawman. Jenkins dismounted, accepting the cup of water Delilah offered with a grateful nod. "Afternoon, Mrs. Wright, Marshal." Though Luke had long since given up the title, Jenkins still used it occasionally out of habit and respect. "What brings you out our way, Sheriff?" Luke asked, sending the boys to fetch a bucket of water for the sheriff's horse. "Thought you'd want to know," Jenkins said, his expression serious. "Got word that Dirk Morgan escaped from territorial prison last week." Luke's face hardened at the name. Dirk Morgan had been Jeb Blackwater's second in command, the only member of the gang to be captured alive during that fateful showdown in Monticello years earlier. "Any sign of him in these parts?" Luke asked, automatically moving closer to Delilah and Elizabeth. "Not yet," Jenkins replied, "but considering his threats at the trial." He glanced meaningfully at Delilah, "Thought it best to warn you." At the trial, Morgan had sworn vengeance on both Luke and Delilah, blaming them for the death of Blackwater and the downfall of the gang. "Appreciate the warning," Luke said, his voice calm despite the tension evident in his shoulders. "We'll keep our eyes open." After Jenkins departed with promises to send word of any sightings, Luke and Delilah gathered the children inside for supper. Though they kept their conversation light for the children's sake, Delilah could see the vigilance returning to Luke's, bearing the constant awareness, the quick glances toward windows and doors. That night, after the children were asleep, they sat together on the porch, the summer night warm around them. "He won't find us," Luke said, breaking the contemplative silence. "And if he does, he won't get near you or the children." Delilah leaned against his shoulder. "I know," she said simply. "I trust you." Luke put his arm around her, drawing her closer. "Remember that first night when I found you in the cave? I made you a promise, to protect us always," Delilah recalled softly, "and you have every day since." "And I will continue to," Luke vowed, pressing a kiss to her temple. No matter what, for a week, they maintained heightened vigilance. Luke kept his rifle closer than usual and instructed Thomas never to wander beyond the immediate yard. Delilah found herself checking on the children more frequently during the night, reassured each time by their peaceful slumber. On the 8th day after Jenkins's visit, Luke had to ride to a neighboring ranch to help with a difficult calving. He left at dawn, promising to return by midday. "Keep the doors locked," he reminded Delilah as he mounted his horse. "And remember where the shotgun is." Delilah nodded, standing on the porch with Elizabeth on her hip and the boys at her side. "We'll be fine," she assured him. "The Jenkins boy is coming over to help with the chores, remember?" Luke relaxed slightly. Young Tim Jenkins, the sheriff's son, was 17 and handy with both work and weapons. "Good. Tell him to keep an eye out." The morning passed uneventfully. Tim arrived shortly after Luke left and set to work on the tasks Luke had left for him. Delilah busied herself with household chores while keeping the children entertained. By mid-morning, storm clouds had gathered on the horizon, the summer heat building toward an afternoon thunderstorm. Delilah called the boys in from the yard as the first distant rumbles of thunder sounded. "Where's Tim?" she asked, noticing the young man wasn't at his usual post near the barn. "He went to check the south pasture fence," Thomas reported. "Said a calf might have gotten out." Delilah frowned slightly. Luke hadn't mentioned any problem with the fence, but it wasn't unusual for new issues to arise on a working ranch. Still, a sense of unease prickled at the back of her neck. "Stay inside," she instructed the children, moving to the window to scan the yard. No sign of Tim, and the storm was drawing closer, dark clouds now obscuring the distant mountains. The first fat raindrops were just beginning to fall when Delilah heard a noise from the back of the house, a scraping sound, like a boot on the porch steps. Relief flooded through her. Tim returning, or perhaps Luke home early. "Thomas, watch your brother and sister," she said, moving toward the back door. "I think Papa or Tim is back." She opened the door, expecting to see a familiar face. Instead, she found herself staring into the cold eyes of a stranger, a man with a weather-beaten face and a jagged scar running from his left eye to his jaw. "Mrs. Wright," he drawled, a malicious smile spreading across his face. "Or should I say Mrs. Nolan? Been a long time coming, this meeting." "Dirk Morgan." Delilah tried to slam the door, but Morgan was quicker, forcing it open and sending her stumbling backward. She regained her footing quickly, putting herself between the intruder and the children. "Thomas," she said, her voice remarkably steady despite the fear coursing through her. "Take James and Elizabeth to the root cellar." Now, Thomas, his young face pale but determined, grabbed his siblings' hands and hurried toward the trapdoor in the kitchen floor that led to the cool storage space below. Morgan made no move to stop them, his attention fixed solely on Delilah. "Let them hide," he said with a cruel laugh. "Makes no difference to me. It's you and that husband of yours I've come for." "Luke isn't here," Delilah said, her mind racing. The shotgun was in the bedroom just down the hall, if she could keep Morgan talking, distracted. "Oh, I know," Morgan replied, stepping further into the house. "Saw him ride out this morning, been watching for days." His smile widened. "Also saw the Jenkins boy. He won't be helping anyone for a while." Cold dread washed over Delilah. "If you've hurt that boy, he's alive," Morgan interrupted dismissively. "For now, trussed up in your barn, though, caused me more trouble than I expected." He drew a revolver from his holster. "Now, Mrs. Wright, here's how this is going to work. You're going to sit right there and wait for your husband to return. Then I'm going to kill him while you watch. Then you. Then I'll decide what to do about those brats of yours." Rage unlike anything Delilah had ever experienced surged through her at the threat to her children. In that moment, she knew she would die before allowing this man to harm them or Luke. "You're not touching my family," she said, her voice low and dangerous. Morgan laughed. "And who's going to stop me?" "You," he gestured with the gun. "Sit down." Instead of complying, Delilah lunged suddenly to her left, toward the hallway that led to the bedroom and the shotgun. Morgan fired, the bullet splintering the doorframe inches from her head. She ducked into the hallway, hearing his heavy footsteps behind her. Reaching the bedroom, she slammed the door and turned the key, buying precious seconds. The shotgun was on a high shelf in the wardrobe, Luke's precaution to keep it out of the children's reach. Delilah dragged a chair over, climbing up as Morgan's boots slammed against the door. Her fingers closed around the cool metal just as the door gave way. She whirled, the weapon heavy in her hands, as Morgan burst into the room. His eyes widened momentarily at the sight of the shotgun, then narrowed in determination. He raised his revolver. "You don't have the nerve," he sneered. Delilah remembered Luke's lessons, his patient instructions on handling the weapon. She leveled the shotgun, her hands steady despite the pounding of her heart. "I have 3 children to protect," she said quietly. "Try me." For a tense moment, they faced each other in silent standoff. Then Morgan's finger tightened on the trigger of his revolver. Delilah fired first. The blast was deafening in the confined space of the bedroom. The shotgun's recoil slammed into her shoulder, but she hardly felt it. Morgan staggered backward, a look of shock on his face as red bloomed across his chest. He fired wildly as he fell, his bullet burying itself in the ceiling. Delilah kept the shotgun trained on him as he collapsed to the floor, his breathing ragged. She didn't approach, remembering Luke's warnings about wounded predators being the most dangerous, Morgan's eyes fixed on her with hatred. "You," Bitch, he gasped. You threatened my family, Delilah replied simply. That was your mistake. Outside, thunder crashed as the storm broke in earnest. Through the bedroom window, Delilah saw a rider approaching at a gallop, heedless of the downpour. Luke. Relief weakened her knees, but she maintained her stance, keeping the shotgun aimed at Morgan until she heard the front door burst open. Delilah, Luke's voice frantic with fear. Delilah, children, in here, she called, her voice remarkably composed. The children are safe in the root cellar. Tim is in the barn, hurt. Luke appeared in the doorway, rainwater streaming from his coat, his gun drawn. He took in the scene in an instant, Morgan bleeding on the floor, Delilah standing firm with the shotgun. Are you all right? He demanded, moving to her side while keeping his gun trained on Morgan. Yes, Delilah answered. Only then did she allow the shotgun to lower slightly. He was waiting for you. He was going to. She couldn't finish the sentence, the full impact of what had nearly happened finally hitting her. Luke's face hardened as he knelt beside Morgan, checking for weapons before turning his attention to the wound. He's alive, but barely, he said after a moment. Need to get him to town. Tim first, Delilah insisted, suddenly remembering the young man. Morgan said he's hurt in the barn. Luke nodded. Stay here, keep the gun on him. I'll check on Tim and the children. He returned minutes later with Tim, supporting the dazed but conscious young man with one arm. The children followed, Thomas holding his siblings' hands, his young face set in a determined expression reminiscent of his stepfather. Mama, Elizabeth cried, breaking free to run to Delilah. Mama's safe. Delilah handed the shotgun to Luke and knelt to embrace her daughter, beckoning the boys to join them. Yes, sweetheart, Mama's safe. We're all safe. Over the children's heads, her eyes met Luke's. The love and pride she saw there brought tears to her eyes, pride not just in her courage, but in the family they had built together, the home they had defended. Later, after Sheriff Jenkins had arrived with a deputy to take Morgan into custody, after Tim had been treated by the doctor for a concussion, after the children had been reassured and settled back to sleep, Luke and Delilah sat together on the porch, watching the storm move eastward, leaving fresh, clean air in its wake. I've never been so scared, Luke admitted, his arm tight around her shoulders. When I saw those clouds gathering and felt that something was wrong, then found Tim coming to in the barn. But you came, Delilah said softly, just like you always have. You didn't need me this time, Luke pointed out, a note of wonder in his voice. You protected our family on your own. Delilah leaned into his embrace. I remembered what you taught me. About the shotgun, yes, but more than that, about courage, about doing whatever is necessary to protect those you love. She turned to look at him directly. I learned that from you, Luke, from watching you keep your promise every day for the past 6 years. Luke's eyes shone with emotion in the fading light. I told you I'd protect you both always, he said, his voice rough. I just didn't expect you'd end up protecting all of us right back. Delilah smiled, feeling the last shadows of the day's terror recede in the warmth of his gaze. That's what family does, she said simply. We protect each other. Always. As stars began to appear in the clearing sky, they sat together in comfortable silence, two people who had found each other against all odds, who had built a life and a family from the ashes of tragedy. The promise made years ago beside a canyon cave had evolved into something richer and deeper, a mutual pledge of protection, support, and enduring love. Always, Luke agreed, pressing a kiss to her forehead as the first fireflies of the evening began to dance across their land, their home, their sanctuary. Always.